definitely want to acknowledge that UCLA is a land grant institution and that we at the UCLA History Project live and work on Tongva land. And that is land that spans from the Los Angeles Basin to the Southern Channel Islands.
I'm going to speak for Michelle right now because she's getting a little bit better, but we recognize that Cal State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. Oh man, I'm not going to disrespect their name.
Yeah, I'll say it.
There you go.
The Yahavatum.
Thank you. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. This is RCOEs. Together we stand on Turtle Island, an indigenous term for the Northern American continent. We are grateful to be able to learn on this piece of Turtle Island. Myself, I'm convening on the ancestral unceded territory of the Keech and Tongva nations and their neighbors whose ancestors tended to the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. The indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished.
All right. We also want to just reintroduce ourselves to you. If this is your first time, this is the team here, and you'll be able to match our faces, our real faces, with these I forget what they're called, bitmojis. So that's me there with the cardigan, and I'm Danny. I'm the director of UCLA History Geography Project. I'm a former high school history teacher. And I've been working with the UCLA History Geography Project for almost 8 years.
That's you, Cindy.
Okay. And yes, good afternoon, everyone. Cindy Mata, the Associate Director at the History Project. Also high school and middle school teacher before joining the UCLA team.
My name's Don Powell. I'm with RCOE. I'm the History Social Science Administrator. We do things all things History Social Science here, and really glad to be able to partner with UCLA to bring this to you guys, and Cal State San Bernardino. Sorry, Michelle. Dang, that was almost a really bad diss. And I was a high school teacher for 10 years and an high school administrator for a few years after that. And then now I'm doing the good work here. So thanks for, yeah.
I'm Michelle Lorimer. I'm a historian at Cal State San Bernardino. I do a lot of work on California history and local history, and I've been working with folks like Danny and Cindy Amparo and Dawn for the last few years. So happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Bitmoji-less person there. I tried updating my Bitmoji right before the meeting, and I didn't tell Danny to refresh. So I have been a educator for 31 years. I am a former elementary, middle school, and high school teacher. And I am very excited to be here with you. I've very much enjoyed our work in working with the RCOE. So welcome. And we have a wonderful program today, so we're excited. I also want to send a shout out to Mark, who had to step away, but Mark is the person who keeps everything together. He's the 4th member of the UCLA team, and he helps us with breakout rooms and putting things in the chat and making sure that things are functioning behind the scenes a lot of times. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So that's the team, and we want to talk to you a little bit about the goals of this workshop. If this is if you've been to all the workshops, then this is a review. If you're new, then what we're doing is a a workshop that is funded by Teaching with Primary Sources. And Teaching with Primary Sources is part of the Library of Congress. It's their initiative to support history instruction in classrooms. So one of the goals that TPS has for these workshops is that we understand the inquiry process. This was really like a big push, I would say about 7-8 years ago. Seems like more and more every year teachers in history are becoming more comfortable with inquiry, but we still want to center inquiry and thinking about how we frame good inquiry questions. You'll see that modeled today from our historian, and then when we do our breakout rooms, you'll see some of us have some inquiry questions attached to the activities that we're sharing with you. One of the other goals is to analyze primary sources. We're going to do a whole lot of that today. They also are encouraging you to explore the Library of Congress website, which we also encourage because there's a tremendous amount of resources. You're going to see some of those primary sources showcased today, this workshop. And then one of your options is to design an inquiry activity with at least one primary source from the Library of Congress. And it's a pretty easy process. I'm going to talk more about that at our next workshop, and I'll have some an email with some like detailed directions on how to do it. But it's a relatively easy process if you want to design an inquiry activity with the topic that we're exploring. The topic that we're exploring is local history. This TPS workshop is called East Side Stories. These are all stories from the Inland Empire. We've been focusing a lot on San Bernardino and Riverside, with particular emphasis on Riverside. And we've explored sort of stories of folks that are in the margins and in a lot of cases. And these are definitely stories that are not in textbooks. And we believe that the stories that we're learning in this series are more than adequate substitutes for themes that you already teach, such as labor, immigration, movement, citizenship. All of those themes are happening in Riverside, in San Bernardino, in the Inland Empire, in history. So we're trying to showcase those stories, those counter narratives, so that teachers have resources and content knowledge so that they could implement that into the classroom. So the students feel empowered by learning about their local history. Okay. So here's some big goals for East Side Stories, and I'll just go ahead and let you all look those over quickly. If you have any questions, you can just drop in the chat, and we'll do our best to clarify. This workshop is for K-12. The emphasis is on the 4th, 5th grade, K3, 4th, 5th grade. And Amparo is going to be working with those of you who are from the elementary. And then we're going to have middle school breakout group with Dawn. That's going to be our 8th grade teachers. High school, 11th grade, et cetera, is going to be with me today. And then if you're an ethnic studies educator here, Cindy's going to walk you through some pieces that will work well in an ethnic studies course, or as you're planning an ethnic studies course. We're going to go ahead and do a warm up. Amps, I have a visitor. Can you kick it off, and then I'll step? Sorry.
Yeah, your little visitor is behind you. So go ahead. If you could, we're going to be doing a 3-2-1 activity, and it's going to be a little different, but it's going to involve the same amount of kind of process. Daniel, can you go to the next slide? So we're going to be looking at this article by Professor Celia Tsu from UC Davis. And as you read the article, if someone can put it in the chat, I would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and in the meantime, if you all have the agenda up, the article.
Oh, it's hyperlinked on the agenda. Sorry about that. Mm-hmm. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Sorry I interrupted you. I have a delay on my end. Daniel and I live in the same community, and sometimes at this time of the day, there's a little bit of a delay. So I apologize. I think I interrupted. We're going to ask you that as you read this article, you think about 3 things you learned, 2 wonderings or questions, and then to think about one classroom application. You know, how might you use what you're reading in this article? And so if you can go ahead and read, and then we're going to come back and we will probably be sharing as a whole group because we're a small number of people today. So how long are they going to have to read?
It's a pretty short, it's a quick read, I should say. It doesn't look short, but it's a quick read. There's like a couple of pages with images and timelines. I think like 5 minutes, we can do a check-in in 5 minutes. So like 4:20, just to see how you all are doing. If you need more time, we could definitely extend a few more minutes, but it shouldn't take you all long to get through the article.
So if you want to turn your camera off while you read, please feel free to do so. Make sure that we'll give you some time alerts and that you identify your 3 and your 2 and your 1. See you in a little bit. If you would like to share your 3, 2, 1 in the chat, please feel free to do so. If you are, if you have a little more energy, we know everyone's tired and we know everybody's been having a lot on their plates, and you would like to unmute and share with us, please feel free to do so as well. Whatever you feel comfortable with today, we want to honor that everyone's at different places. All our energies are different and that we are here together to learn. So please, if you'd like to share, please do so in the chat or unmute yourself. We're a small group today.
I have something that I thought was really interesting. There was a lot of important information in there, but I am in the Coachella Valley. So we spend a lot of time talking about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the strike, the grape strike. And so I did not realize that there were 2,000 Filipino farm workers who sort of banded together with Chavez to be a stronger force during that strike. So I thought that was tremendously interesting and definitely something I want to make sure that I'm pushing out to my 4th graders as we continue to study the agriculture here in our valley.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Larry Idleong and Mr. Veracruz, and I can't remember third gentleman, were the organizers of the Filipino workers. And they, in fact, knew Dolores Huerta. Dolores brought the 2 groups together. And so if you would like some additional resources, let me know. We do have some for other workshops that I can share with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dolores Huerta doesn't get the credit she deserves. I always tell my kids that. That's a side note for all the women.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like Amparo said, if you would like to share in the chat, feel free to, and we can read that. If you have a busy household or you just don't have the energy to unmute or turn on your screen, share in the chat and we can share on your behalf.
I can share too. Sorry, I'm in my car. I also was things that I learned I'm currently on the Great Depression right now, so that's where my mind's at. And we just finishing up today Mexican repatriation in the 1930s, and then also like the redlining and the New Deal and stuff like that. But I didn't have anything like specific for the Asian American community. And so in here on the timeline, it's referencing that there were mob riots and violence against the Filipino community in Northern California, which I wasn't aware of. So that's something that I'm going to look and dig deeper into for
that. Yes, there are, at least in LA, I know of the big one is the 1871, but I also know that there were smaller instances throughout California where this happened. So it is important, and you're right that it's absolutely connected to the Great Depression and to other times where the country was going through economic, downfalls as well.
Along those lines, sorry.
Hey, go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, sorry. Along those lines, I wrote something else in the chat, but the last comment reminded me. I had known a connection between the Filipinos and the Mexican American community in Los Angeles for the Tutsi riot. But I didn't know that besides being persecuted in that area together with Mexican Americans, they were also being targeted to leave the country, because it reminded me of course, the forced repatriation of Mexicans. So it's definitely an area that is of my interest, and I'm going to have to research further.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. This is what we want to happen, is for us to share information and make those connections and bring those to our students. So thank you very much, everyone. That's exactly what we hope, that you would like this article and think about different ways of using it. Thank you.
And, Hannah, I see something, and even Professor Asaka, if you'd like to share, Hannah. If not, we can read on your behalf. Okay, great. So it looks like Hannah was pointing out the Naturalization Act 1790, the Free White Persons, and that was rescinded in 1952. Which is recent, right? It seems like it's really recent, and it is real recent. Wondering about multiracial and mixed status families, a really good question. I think Professor Asaka is going to talk a bit about that today in terms of like the family dynamic, and why it was so challenging to have a family dynamic in the beginnings of the immigration process to California. And then we also have a couple of links, one from Michelle, which is a link to the Watsonville riot. So thank you all for reading this and participating with the 321. I think something that you said, Sandra, is resonating with me. It's those connection points. That's one of the things that we really are emphasizing here, is that these stories are going to sound familiar because they're part of a larger shared experience. And one of the things that we are sort of pushing back against in this workshop is this idea that we have to teach US history through a lens of like East Coast or Midwest stories, or when we have some of those similar stories with the same theme, with the same like immigration or industrialization, we have similar stories in our community that should be elevated and that students should know about, because it's their community, and it's more empowering and engaging if you're learning about somebody who is from Riverside versus the experience of somebody who is from like Illinois. Right? Not to say that that's not interesting, but it's important that we localize when possible. The framework is even asking us to do that. So thank you. Let me just emphasize something real quick before we transition to our historian today. For all of the workshops, if you've noticed, we try to provide some sort of framework. We did that when we were talking about Indigenous history, and we talked about the 6 historic failings of teaching Indigenous history. You can find that on our resource guide if you weren't here. The second one, we also had like a framework that would be useful in teaching about the particular topic that we explored, which was like the Citrus Belt and experiences of Latinx folks. And today, one of the things that Cecilia Su points out in this article is these 4 overarching like points that have come to typify the experiences of AAPI folks, immigrants in the United States. And one of them is they're seen as the perpetual foreigner, right? One of the xenophobic tropes is that, the sort of go back to and filling the blank of your home country, sort of like perpetual foreigner idea, no matter how long you've been in this country. And that's not necessarily unique to the AAPI community, but it's something that's definitely a theme. And she talks about how you see this coming up and over again. And again, you see it right now with like COVID, right? And sort of the anti-AAPI racism and violence that's been happening in our country since the pandemic started. You also see how public health crises on that note, right, are often, though fingers are pointed at immigrant communities. We heard a little bit about that last time with the community of laborers living in Riverside, and again with AAPI folks. Depressions and the scapegoats, or taking jobs, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Working Men's Party. If you teach 11th and 8th grade, you know that was the party in California that was very much opposed to Chinese immigration and labor, and is seen as one of the sort of beginning the process of having the Chinese Exclusion Act passed. And then resistance from the community and activism. And that's a point that we like to emphasize as well, is these stories of resistance, resilience, and joy in spite of all this stuff. We really want to highlight those as well, so that it's not just like a big bummer, so that we can start to build some critical hope by learning from past actions of resistance and activism, so empower our students. Okay. So if you have any questions or anything that you would like to point out, you can go ahead and do that in the chat. And we're going to go ahead and transition now. So I'm going to hand this off to Dawn, and Dawn's going to introduce today's speaker. And we're really excited to hear this talk.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Osaka is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside, where she specializes in Asian American history, urban history, and public humanities. Trained as an interdisciplinary scholar and public historian, her work seeks to develop new methodologies and frameworks of analysis for understanding the urban past and present. Dr. Osaka's current book project, Exclusionary City, A History of Seattle from the Margins, reorients the early history of Seattle through the lens of those displaced and erased in the making of the city as a modern metropolis. The dissertation on which this project is based won prizes from the American Historical Association, Pacific Coast Branch, and the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. She has also worked extensively in the field of public history, including 5 years as an oral historian and archivist for Densho, a community-based organization that documents and shares the stories of Japanese American incarceration through an online archive and other digital platforms. We're really excited to have Dr. Osaka here. And so without further ado, here she is.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dawn, for that introduction. And thank you for being here with me today. I know folks are so busy and have so much going on. And if you have to, leave early, that's totally fine. This talk will be recorded, so you can view the recording. I'll also have Danny circulate my slides if you want to look at that and have the PDF, because I have a slide at the end with some resources, some further resources and additional information. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can folks see that okay? Is that showing up all right? Okay, I never know how this is going to look on Zoom. Okay, well, as the title of this slide says, my talk today is going to be on creating community in Riverside's Chinatown. Asian Americans are a very diverse group of people, right? Where in some ways that kind of is the thing that is the most common among us, is that we're so diverse. People from many different regions, different countries of origin, language groups, times of arrival. I'm a 4th generation Asian American. My family came over in the early 20th century. And then there are 2nd generation Asian Americans and more recent immigrants. But I want to focus actually today on the Chinese immigrant experience and the historic Chinatown community here in Riverside. In part, that's because Chinese immigrants were so central to the workforce. They were among the first workers in the region, right? They came as early as the 1860s. They helped build the economy of the Inland Empire, as well as the physical infrastructure, right? The roads, the railroad tracks, the canals, and many of the buildings were built using Chinese labor. But I think I also want to focus on this group because their experiences with racism, and exclusion did set the stage for the experiences of other Asian groups who came after them, right? So that kind of was reflected, I think, in Cecilia Sue's, the timeline that she gave. You can see how there were these patterns kind of starting with the Chinese. So the government, for example, built on the Chinese Exclusion Act to later then restrict Japanese, Korean, South Asian, Filipino immigration. And similarly, the efforts to restrict, segregate, and exclude Chinese immigrants on the local level set the stage for how local municipalities, as well as sort of elites, would segregate, restrict, and exclude these other immigrant groups as well. So when I teach Asian American history, I always do start with Chinese immigration, in part because they arrived first, but also because their experiences can also help us to understand the experiences of these groups that came later, right? Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Indian, right? Okay, so this talk, I really have 2 goals for today. And the first is to highlight the local movement against Chinese immigrants in Riverside that in many ways peaked in the 1880s, but that persisted, I think, beyond that. Though Chinese people played a vital role as workers, they were also viewed as unworthy for inclusion into US society. They were desired as labor, but not as full citizens or equal participants. And I know all of you are probably familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? The federal immigration law that restricted Chinese immigration. Equally important though, and I'll talk about this, were the local laws and policies and actions taken on the local level to really, again, restrict and segregate Chinese residents who are already living in the US. And this is what we see happening in Riverside as elsewhere. Local actions and policies did also play a big role in the lives of Chinese and also other Asian immigrants during this period. So that's kind of the first goal of the talk. The second goal of the talk is actually to highlight the other part of the story, and that is how Chinese immigrants created their own forms of community and family amidst this racism and exclusion. Racism did not define who they were or how they lived their lives. And I think it's important to understand those kind of broader forces that were acting against them and targeting them, but it's not the whole story. Chinese immigrants did form a vibrant community here in Riverside and really throughout many places in Southern California. And I think of this actually as a form of resistance, right? Forming community can be understood as a kind of resistance, saying we're staying here, we're putting down roots, we're creating a community, we're living our lives despite these efforts to remove us from the town, to diminish us, and to define us as disposable laborers and as aliens, right? So I wanted to talk about these two parts of the story. The first part of the talk, so I'll talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes about sort of how Chinese immigrants ended up in Riverside, the forces that were propelling them away from China, pulling them towards Southern California. I'll then discuss the anti-Asian climate in Riverside and throughout the region and really give specific examples of how they were targeted. And I think we'll take a short break and then I'll come back. And the second part of the talk will really delve into what daily life looked like in Riverside's Chinatown. And in particular, as Danny mentioned before, I'll focus on the different forms of family and kinship that we see forming within this community, because one of the efforts targeting Chinese immigrants was restricting their ability to form families, to have wives and children. But they formed communities of their own nonetheless. So I wanted to highlight that. And so I think this is a good sort of summary also of my inquiry question, right? Which is, how did Chinese immigrants create community amidst racism and exclusion? And I think, you can ask this about many different communities, right? Not just Chinese, you can ask this about, Japanese immigrants. So it's an important question in terms of acknowledging both that they experienced racism, but also that it didn't completely define their lives, and they led their lives and they resisted and they were resilient nonetheless. So, okay, that's kind of the broader arc of the talk. So let's get started. All right, and if you have any questions or if anything's unclear, please, feel free to type it in the chat. Or raise your hand in Zoom. So I'm happy to answer questions if anything's not clear or if you want to add anything. Okay, so understanding why and how Chinese immigrants ended up in Riverside, I think of it as both a global and also a local story. I always teach Asian American history very much within these two scales as a global and a local story. So globally, Chinese immigrants began leaving China in the mid-19th century, especially in the 1840s, 1850s. And this was a period when China was being targeted by Europe and the United States, kind of Western powers, who wanted to control Chinese markets and they wanted to control trade in and out of China. China had been a very important country for many centuries, right? It was very important to trade. There were many important products and commodities, right, that were produced in China, tea and silk and porcelain. They were highly desired around the world. And we see beginning in the 19th century, the West wants to control this trade and begins to, wage wars in China. This slide here shows a kind of a drawing depicting a scene from the Opium War. You've probably heard about this. There are 2 Opium Wars, and they were fought by European countries and the United States in China during the 1840s and 1850s. China ended up losing these wars and was forced into a kind of semi-colonial status, right, vis-a-vis the West. So they were forced to pay a lot of money, cede land to the West, open up their ports to foreign traders, allow missionaries in their country for the first time. So it put them in a very sort of diminished place compared to what they once were. And so we see these wars really create a lot of disruption in Chinese society. Political instability, economic turmoil, social problems. There was a widespread famine. So this is creating a lot of disruption and impoverishment for everyday people in China. And so they begin to look for opportunities abroad. And I should mention that this is happening in China. It's also happening in other Asian countries, right, in this late 19th century period. China, Japan, the Philippines, right? They were kind of being targeted with the growing power of Western imperialism and military aggression. So the mass immigration abroad, and this is millions of Chinese people were leaving China, going to Southeast Asia, going to South America, going to the Caribbean, going to Canada, the United States. It coincided in the US with, the end of the Civil War and the rise of the industrial economy, right? The industrialization of the US economy, which had this demand for labor, right? Building railroads and mining, agriculture, right? That kind of low wage labor that was in demand after the Civil War. In Southern California, Chinese immigrants become the dominant labor force starting in the 1860s, in part because they were already here. Many had arrived in the 1840s and 50s during the gold rush. And the gold rush was actually a global phenomenon. It was happening all over the world, these gold rushes, and Chinese immigrants were coming, right, to try their luck mining gold. And so they were already here in California. And in fact, interestingly enough, Chinese businessmen and entrepreneurs in the US actually developed this business. They were called employment agents or labor contractors who would recruit Chinese workers in and around California and also from China and kind of funnel them into the workforce and work on writing contracts for these big industrial firms like railroad companies. So that's in part why we also see so many Chinese workers working for the railroad. There was a huge business in Chinese labor contracting and employment. So in terms of Riverside, as many of you know, right, Riverside was a center of citrus industry. But actually before this, right, they were working in many different industries, right, before citrus. So they were employed, at first, they came to actually the inland region as railroad workers, laying railroad track. They also dug canals. They, as I mentioned before, built some of the foundations of some of these buildings, right, that in and around Riverside. And kind of later on, they became employed by the citrus growers. And I would actually argue that the pre-existing presence of Chinese workers in Riverside allowed for the citrus industry to grow. Chinese workers also brought with them a lot of specialized knowledge about citrus cultivation. Oranges were a Chinese fruit. And so a lot of them had knowledge. They came from regions where oranges were grown. And so they contributed that knowledge as well as their labor to this industry. Okay, so it's difficult to kind of know how many Chinese immigrants, like the population numbers in the late 19th century, because the population was very migratory and was seasonal. So you could have as many as 3,000 to 4,000, right, Chinese immigrants in Riverside, and then the population would go down after harvest season to a few hundred. I do know that by 1900, the kind of permanent population in Riverside was, Chinese population was around 300. But again, that swelled and then it decreased, right, based on the, the harvest seasons and these other like labor cycles. Okay. In addition to seasonal labor and work in the railroads and this more familiar work, the Chinese residents also worked as servants. Domestic work was a very common occupation for many Chinese and also other Asian immigrants. Often when they would come to the US, domestic work was the first job that they would do. They would be hired to work in the homes of wealthy white residents of these towns. Eliza Tibbetts, for example, had a Chinese servant. And at the time, they were called, I feel somewhat derisively, they were called houseboys. That's how they were referred to. And it was mostly men who did this work. In addition to doing domestic work, they also opened up small businesses, laundries. They also leased land near the Santa Ana River, grew vegetables, and they worked as vegetable peddlers. So there was a real diversity in terms of what kind of work they were doing, and they were so important to the local and the regional economy. Okay, so by 1885, Chinese residents had established a small Chinatown right in the heart of Riverside, what was then kind of a burgeoning commercial district. So this is actually a Sanborn map, fire insurance map, that was drawn in, I believe it is from 1885. And this is kind of the middle of town. I don't know how well you can see it. It's really small. But you can see, so this was the Riverside's first Chinatown. And it's located here between 8th and 9th Streets and Orange and Main, right? So right in the kind of middle of the center of the town here. And businesses included, here I included like a kind of a close-up of the actual, what was called the Chinese Quarter. So there were many buildings, right? About a dozen buildings. There were laundries, there were lodging houses, which you can see here, a kind of Chinese boarding house, Chinese dwelling. There was also a general store. Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, Danny. They can all be found at the Library of Congress, these maps. They're great resources, primary sources. There was a Kwang Mo Long general store, which sold merchandise for both white residents and Chinese residents. This was not just a Chinese store. It served many different people in the town of Riverside. And it's important to note as well that many of these businesses served a kind of multiracial clientele, right? They served whites as well as Chinese. They served everyone. And one of the laundry owners in the 1880s named Chen Wo, he became very successful, and he started a kind of laundry delivery service, actually. So he delivered laundry to residents who lived, on the outside of town. There was also vegetable peddlers, right, who they would actually go around and sell vegetables to people, go door to door, right? And here's some of the really, I love these sort of photographs here, some early photos showing some of these like delivery services. And I think just emphasizing the mobility of these residents and how integrated they were, right, into the town, the economy, and their interaction. I also wanted to mention that there was also a Chinese New Year's festival that was enjoyed by many people in Riverside and actually was popular, grew into a popular event. And we're talking 1870s, 1880s. So even as early as 1880, we do see a Chinese New Year festival being held and people, coming to enjoy it. So I would argue, though, that the integration of Chinese residents and their economic contributions to the town life was actually what fueled anti-Chinese sentiment in Riverside and the hostility against them. So Chinese immigrants were more or less, I would say, accepted in Riverside through the 1870s. But this begins to shift. And this kind of mirrors shifts that we see, around the region and also up and down the West Coast, that there was more or less some kind of tolerance of them up into a point, and then it shifts. So we begin to see this first sustained shift of anti-Chinese sentiment in the 1880s, as I mentioned earlier. Luther Holt, some of you may have heard of. He was a very wealthy resident. He was kind of a promoter of large land developments. He was the editor of the local paper. He was kind of one of these booster types. He was vehemently anti-Chinese. and began a campaign to remove them from the town. And this is a quote here I pulled from one of his editorials. So he would write these editorials like every week that would talk about what a danger the Chinese were. And here it says, in 1885, Riverside publisher and booster Luther Holt spearheaded a campaign to, quote, drive the Chinatown out and tear down their filthy quarters. He pressed for war against Chinatown, what he called an abominable place that was breeding disease in the very heart of the town. So you can hear in this language, right? He's using actually, issues around like disease, right? And sanitation as one of the justifications for driving them out. And this is also appeared, I noticed, on Cecilia Sue's thematic kind of list of, anti-Asian hostility, which is this idea that they're, they're bringing diseases, right? They're spreading diseases, they're unsanitary. And this was a very powerful, I think, justification that many people like Luther Holt used to shut down their businesses and drive them out of town. Yes, exactly. And we have unfortunately seen how lasting this actually is, right? This myth with COVID. We've seen that firsthand. So it was present even in the 1880s, right? Okay. So again, he was kind of drumming up, I think, and I think like from what I've seen, he himself was very personally racist against the Chinese, but I also want to stress that I also believe that he had an economic desire for their land, right? He wanted their land, which was located in the center of town. That was very valuable, right? This kind of commercial sort of land and where it was located. So that was also I believe that was also a prime motivating factor for him too. Okay, so he urged a boycott on Chinese businesses, and he sort of just drummed up fomented a lot of this anti-Chinese sentiment. And this is the kind of language that we see appearing every day in the newspapers, and not just in Riverside, this was everywhere. San Francisco, Seattle, right, Portland, all of these cities, and also local towns. This is the kind of language that people were hearing and reading, right, every day. We have to go to war against them, remove them. It was very violent, right, language. So this coincided with other actions against the Chinese residents, including more boycotts of Chinese businesses. And then in 1885, Riverside town leaders passed an anti-Chinese ordinance that prohibited the construction of wooden buildings in the Chinese quarter, the Chinese district in Chinatown, and allowed the present ones already there to be condemned by the health officer. So again, they're using public safety, public health as a kind of cover to drive these residents out of town and to basically take their land, right? To take the land that they had been inhabiting. In addition, Holt and other leaders in Riverside pressured the landowners who actually owned the properties, who rented to Chinese businesses, to raise their rents by $500 a month, which, I mean, even now that would be prohibitive, but back then it was basically impossible to pay that. And I should say that these local, so this is a kind of a newspaper clip from Los Angeles. And it just goes to show how like what was happening in Riverside was reflected in many other places. And a lot of them were targeting laundries because this was a very common business for Chinese immigrants, right? That a lot of them opened laundries. I'll talk a little bit about this later. But using, again, this idea that they're sort of unsanitary, which is ironic because laundry is all about cleaning things. So you can just see though how it's nonsensical. But using it to restrict them to shut down their businesses and to take the land and to remove them from the town. So I just wanted to note that these were very common. Interestingly though, let me just let's see. Yes, okay. So interestingly though, these laws were actually declared unconstitutional in 1886. So we see these kind of laws pop up in the early 1880s, right? 1880, 1881 through 1885 and 86. But in 1886, there's actually a Supreme Court case. And I wanted to highlight this as a kind of an example of resistance here, is that a Chinese immigrant named Yik Wo, who lived in San Francisco, his laundry was shut down by a very similar ordinance to what we see in Riverside. But he actually fought this in court. And his case actually went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled, and what, according to legal scholars, was a very important legal ruling. The Supreme Court ruled that ordinances like the ones that we see in Riverside, right, that were targeting sort of shutting down these wooden buildings and prohibiting wooden construction in particular areas were unconstitutional. And the justices argued that they were unconstitutional because they were laws that on their face were race neutral, but were administered in a prejudicial manner. And this was a violation of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. So actually by 1886, because of the efforts of a Chinese immigrant named Yik Wo, right, we see these ordinances actually become, they can't be used anymore. They're unconstitutional. But in that short window of time, the laws did have, I would argue, their intended effect, right? They were quite effective. They were short-lived, but very effective. In Riverside, Chinese leaders got together and they decided to move the Chinatown to the outskirts of town as a form of protection against the rising tide of hostility and harassment that they were facing. Yeah, Dawn. Yeah, yes, right. So it's interesting that in 1886, this was a ruling, which was very, I mean, given this anti-Chinese sentiment, it was very surprising to a lot of people. And it was an important law at the time. And I should mention too, sorry, just a side note, that Asian immigrants, Chinese, Japanese, right, use the legal system to challenge a lot of these discriminatory laws. There are so many examples of Chinese and Japanese and other Asian immigrants challenging exclusion through the court system. I should say that too. So Yik Wo was part of this much larger kind of legal effort to challenge exclusion and racist sort of laws and policies in court. Okay, but they had their intended effect, right? That they were short-lived, effective though. And Riverside's Chinese leadership kind of saw what was happening. Their primary concern, I think, was to protect the community. They understood that this is what was happening, and this is coinciding with a lot of anti-Chinese violence, physical violence in places like Wyoming, in Eureka, right? There was a lot of like mob attacks happening. So they decided that they would move their Chinatown to the outskirts of the town as a form of protection. So they wanted to protect people and to protect them from the harassment they were facing. So they found land on the outskirts of Riverside, right, just kind of right off Brockton Avenue today, kind of southwestern edge of Riverside. They managed to pool together money to purchase a 7-acre plot of land. And they did this by forming a new company called the Quang Nim Company. And this was quite common that we see land, Don's writing the, yeah, exactly. This was quite common. We see a lot of immigrants sort of purchasing land by forming companies. And actually, it's important to note that the person who actually purchased the land for this new Chinatown, the 7-acre plot of land, was a Chinese American. He was a US citizen. And this is important because there were restrictions on Chinese immigrants from owning property at the time, right? And other Asian groups as well. There were a lot of restrictions. I don't think it was sort of, we don't have an alien land law until 1913 in California, but there were still restrictions even before that. So they decided to have a Chinese American man who had been born in the United States and was a US citizen to actually purchase the property, again, to ensure that they would have no problems and it wouldn't be taken away again. So he bought the land and it in some ways became a refuge, right? I mean, I think the second Chinatown was created under duress, but it did become a refuge. And this is true of other Chinatowns as well in this period when there's a lot of anti-Chinese violence and a lot of hostility against Chinese immigrants. We see actually the population of Chinatowns across the, up and down the Pacific coast just swelling during this period because people are coming from, sort of rural areas. They're coming from places all over and kind of coming to Chinatowns, these urban Chinatowns as a place of refuge, right? So this is a time actually when we see Chinatowns, just the population really expanding because many people were seeking them out as spaces of protection. And so anyway, we see this is kind of happening amidst like a broader movement The difference in Riverside, though, is that the Chinese immigrants had to physically move there, right? They moved their Chinatown to the outskirts of the city. And interestingly, when they were preparing to move, the original Chinatown, so the one right here, caught fire and actually burned to the ground, right? So that everything burned this kind of in this first Chinatown. There's the story behind the arson is not kind of known, right? Arson, or the, who burned down the Chinatown. There is some people who believe that Chinese residents lit the fire themselves as a form of protest against their treatment and forced removal. Another possibility is arson. We don't know. There's many different stories, I think, which is interesting, that still exist and are circulating today about what happened to that first Chinatown and why did it burn. Okay, and so this Chinatown, the original Chinatown, right, was taken. The buildings were burned to the ground, and Chinese residents, in some ways, decided to flee to the outskirts of the city to form their new Chinatown. So I think maybe we can take a quick break. Danny and Dawn, is that okay? I wanted to make sure folks were, Zoom can be like kind of a lot. So I wanted to make sure people had like maybe, I don't know how long you usually allow, but to leave you actually though, before we break for a little bit, with these two side-by-side images of the same city block, right, in 1885 and 1887. So this one on the left is from 1885. This is when the first Chinatown was still there, right? This is where the buildings were. And then you can see in 1887, what was built on top of basically the ashes of this Chinatown. And you can see how much development happened in just 2 years. And so to me, this is a really good example of the economic motivations, right, for a lot of these actions against Chinese immigrants and Chinese residents. We can see that they wanted the land, wanted it here, and they wanted the Chinese to leave, just by the sheer amount of development that happened. Okay, so I wanted to point that out too. And these, again, are both taken from Sanborn maps, which are really great sources to use. And I'm just reading some comments here in the chat too. Yeah.
Well, you know what, Professor Osaka, you know what we were thinking, just because the group is small, we usually have 30, 40, 50 people, but because we're so small, maybe we can just debrief the first part of the talk together. So this is a chance for you, like Sandra just put something in the chat. So, this is an opportunity for us to, one, we can ask some questions for clarification or follow-up questions, but also this is a chance for us to think about classroom application. What connecting points are you making to what you teach and what you're hearing, etc. So, yeah. With that being said, does anybody want to unmute, ask a question, share a connection, or just bring up a point? Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, Yik Wo is really interesting. The legal, I teach periodically the actual like language of the case. It's short, it's like 3 or 4 pages, and you can see the justifications, the legal reasonings. It's a really great primary source. And there's a question about who bought the land. I'm not sure exactly who bought the land. White landowners, property owners. There were a lot of real estate companies that would. So the thing that I wanted to mention is that fire actually was an economic opportunity for cities during this period. And so we see a lot of cities, fire was a way to open up the land, right, and redevelop the land. So that was one thing I wanted to say. I'm not sure specifically who bought the land though, who opened the buildings, who bought the property. Yeah, that specific question, I'm not sure.
One of the points that is coming up for me is it seems like a lot of the topics and the stories that we're telling are coming from this same part in Riverside. This I think it's East Side and Arlington and like these older communities where you had Mexican migrant workers living. you had Chinese workers and Korean and Japanese. And so a lot of the stories are coming out of the same kind of, I don't want to say exactly the same area, but it's in the, right, the relatively the same area. And it was that one of those communities, right? One of those colonial communities. Is that relatively accurate, Professor Osaka?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think this, and I just want to address Sandra's point too, that, so one thing I wanted to say is you're totally right. And what we see actually is with these cases like Yik Wo and a lot of Chinese immigrants who bring these legal cases, a lot of them actually move back to China. A lot of them are so, you know, I don't know, they're so sort of disillusioned, and these legal cases took so long and took a toll that it actually, you know, I believe, I don't know if it's Yik Wo or someone else that who also brought a case. It was extremely taxing, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really good point.
I would like to add something, because it resonated with Danny, what Danny said earlier. One of the things, like yesterday, I was talking to the students about Martin Luther King, but I focused my lesson on the difficult histories, right? Like I showed them some testimonies of like people clapping when he was like learning that he was murdered, or like this idea, because we all have this beautiful image of the very loved Martin Luther King. But I wanted to teach the students about all the hate that he received, right? And posing the question, if you had been alive back then, which side would you have been on? And where were you, for example, now during the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And that could tell you a lot. But anyhow, one of the things after finishing that ugly side of the history, and every time I teach a difficult history, I tell them that there's always has been the people that do good, right? And if we just look at the ugly, then we become discouraged, and it's, I don't know, it's horrible. But we focus on the people that did good, and not only that, but we become inspired by them. And I tell them that, and that's not enough, then you become them, right? You want to be that people. And the story of the guy that Jik Woo, right? It's inspiring, but I keep hearing this, and I love to highlight the agency of the people that fought for justice. But today, for some reason, it just hit me that it's so depressing. They have to keep fighting and all their energy, and it's so hard to hear that many of them just return after fighting this fight because they're so tired, right? And it's the idea of all the potential that is lost, all the beauty that is lost, all the greatness that is lost because it's so engaged in surviving or in fighting for, like Martin Luther King said, for a cup of coffee at the counter, right? So just wanted to say that, Danny, it sounded, when you said it, it reminded me of my conversation yesterday. Sorry if I took too much of your time.
Yeah, and I'm seeing economic gain for sure. That was a huge driving factor, I think, especially in this particular era. This is an era when cities were, right, expanding, and they wanted the land. You know, I think that's what it comes down to. There was a lot of economic gain that happened too, right? I think it's important to highlight the personal sort of, I mean, Luther Holt was obviously racist, but there was an economic gain that happened right through this as well. So I think I always try to stress that too. Dawn's, oh, is this about the Sanborn maps, Dawn? Okay. Yeah, the Sanborn maps are very interesting sources because, so if you look on this one here on the left, already you can see the Chinese are being targeted because they say Chinese on the map. When you look, you don't see when it's just a white business or a white person operating the business, right? It doesn't say that. There's no name. The Chinese are clearly being pointed out on this map, and we see this with other groups too, right? Yeah, exactly. And going back, I'm just reading the chat here too, going back to this point that Sandra made. I mean, this is going to sound like, I mean, I honestly think that that's, you know, that was the point of, you know, so much of this. It was like, it's like they wanted Chinese and other Asian workers to come here for their labor, but they didn't want them to be part of US society. And it's like and in some ways I feel like the climate was so hostile that it's like, that's what they wanted. They wanted to force them out. They wanted to force them out. They wanted them to leave. They wanted them not to have a future here in this country, So, and it's like, yeah, that's this period for me. It's just every time I talk about the story, it's like, it comes back to me too. It's like, that's what it was about. It was about, they wanted their work. And then after they were done, they wanted them to leave. They didn't want them to be here. And Japanese incarceration as well. Yeah, right.
If I could throw in, I think in terms of if we think of elementary school teachers, and if you look at some of the materials that Don shared with us, the color coding refers to different kinds of buildings. And so that's a good way maybe for you to think about how might you have your own students create a map of a community block and identify using different colors as a key as to what these buildings mean. How would they label the buildings, right, in their community? Would they identify them by the ethnic identity of the owner, or would they identify them by the name of the business or the kind of business that they are? How would they identify these? And what would make one community, those of you who teach high school, what would make one community more prevalent to be a danger, right? Because we know that these Sanborn maps were then used for redlining. So what would you identify if you look at these maps as making them a more unsafe community or a more unsafe block than another one? And the importance of this insurance, right, map determining so much of people's lives in many ways, not only what their neighborhoods, how their neighborhoods were redlined, but what their property was valued at. And the implications of that, I think, are also important as we think about how we might use these maps in our classrooms.
Yeah, Michelle's talking about, assessing risk. These maps were used for insurance purposes, and that's what insurance was doing, right? And rating certain people as more risky, right, than others and that's where we see with redlining maps as well. One interesting exercise too I do sometimes is because maps are sometimes, it's hard to analyze them, I feel sometimes. So you can also think about different kinds of maps. Right. So this is very, very much a map from, the insurance company coming in and, defining everything. But another way you can think about it is like these kind of cognitive maps or mental maps. Sometimes you find these as sources in the archives. And these are really interesting maps that show how people at the time viewed their space, and you can see the differences. So sometimes you're able to do a comparison there. And it's really interesting to see, coming from a person who lives in the community, what does their map look like versus what does the map look like when it's being defined by, a kind of outside agent that has, sort of an agenda, right? Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, any other questions or comments that folks have? Because if not, we're going to jump into the second part of this talk.
Danny, how much time do I have? I wasn't doing a good job of keeping time. I'm sorry.
That's a really good question. Usually we try to go 5:30 to 5:35, 5:40. I mean, we're a small group today, so I think you can, as long as it's like by 5:40, I think we'll be fine.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Okay, so this kind of starting part 2 of the talk. So by 1886, Riverside's Chinese residents had left, in many ways, the ruins of their old district. I mean, it had literally been burned to the ground. And they moved to the outskirts of the city where they formed a new Chinatown. And by the early 1890s, this new Chinatown was much bigger than the other one in terms of size and scale. It consisted of over 24 buildings. There were shops, laundries. There was a popular restaurant there called Lung's Restaurant. There was a barber shop. There was also an employment agency. I talked about earlier the role of Chinese kind of employment agents and labor contractors. There was an employment agency in Chinatown as well. And you do see people coming into Chinatown to secure employment, domestic servants and other jobs. And again, though, formed in some ways as a response to hostility and exclusion, Chinese immigrants, weren't kind of contained and confined within the space either. They continued to circulate. They continued to be mobile around the region as they had before. We still see vegetable peddlers, right? Vegetable peddlers were especially targeted by a lot of this kind of anti-Chinese language by Holt, but they continued to do their work. They continued to deliver vegetables. We continue to see laundry, right, delivery services. And as I mentioned, we still see people coming into Chinatown, white women, I've seen sort of examples of white women coming to Chinatown, to the employment office to hire domestic workers. You also have migrant workers who are moving in and out of this Chinatown all the time. So it was, in many ways, they transformed it into a very sort of bustling community. And it became an active commercial center. And it was very active. I mean, it's hard to, this photograph, I was trying to find photographs sort of documenting the activity in Chinatown, because it was a very active sort of bustling commercial district, but it was a little difficult. So I just kind of included this one, but it was, the streets were filled with laundry workers, laborers, vegetable hand carts and wagons, shopkeepers. So there were people kind of moving in and out all the time. It was a pretty dynamic community. And in addition to business and commercial developments, Chinatown residents also created and maintained cultural traditions and religion. So many of the early Chinatown residents maintained ties to Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhist traditions of China. And these practices were often in a temple or in the privacy of their own homes or dwellings. And this is actually a picture of a Chinese New Year citrus offering. And this was actually in a private home in Riverside around 1905. And in Riverside's Chinatown, there was the Chinese temple. There was also a shrine right in the center of the town. And I think the existence of these spaces and these kind of cultural and religious and spiritual spaces demonstrate really the importance of, I think, spirituality, and also kind of the practice around, Chinese New Year and visiting the temple reinforced a sense, I think, of collective identity among the residents of Chinatown. I should say, though, that some, actually not all, were sort of Buddhist or Taoist, that some did convert to Christianity. There was a large missionary presence actually in Chinatown, and this was happening all over the place, that Christian missionaries did build a mission school next to Chinatown, and they operated a Sunday school and also conducted services in English with Chinese translation. Later, the United Brethren Church opened another Christian mission school where it operated until 1925. And so there were some Chinese immigrants who did convert to Christianity. Although it's kind of complicated because, right, they still continue to maintain in some ways Chinese cultural traditions as well. But we do see some convert to Christianity. One important aspect, in addition to the kind of commercial life, the religious life and cultural life, I wanted to touch on actually one important aspect of this early Chinatown community, and that was family. So you may have seen in this presentation and elsewhere, right, of photographs, that the Chinese immigrant community was mostly men. And this was true in Riverside. This was true everywhere along the West Coast, everywhere where there were Chinese communities. They were very predominantly male. They weren't exclusively male, and there were women present, but it was overwhelmingly men. And this was actually not an accident, right? This was not just the result of circumstance, but it was created this way through immigration law. And Cecilia Sue in her timeline notes one of these laws, which I also wanted to talk about quickly, and that was the Page Act of 1875. So the Page Act actually predated the Chinese Exclusion Act by 7 years. And so the Page Act prohibited the immigration of Chinese women. It was introduced originally by an anti-Chinese politician in California who wanted to, quote, end the danger of cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women. And so what it did was directed immigration authorities at ports, every port of entry into the United States, to ascertain whether a Chinese woman, or later on any Asian woman, was entering the country for, quote, lewd and immoral purposes. So the language of the law is important because it didn't say all women are banned. It didn't explicitly ban all Chinese women, but it made the process so unbearable and made women subjected to questioning, interrogation that was very harsh, that many stopped coming. And what we see is even those who do choose to immigrate, despite these sort of restrictions, are often turned away. And so this was important too, to point out that it's drawing on stereotypes of Chinese and other Asian women of the time, right? That they're somehow coming to the country for illicit purposes, that they're not respectable. So you can see that very much in the, yeah, I'm looking at the chat exactly, right? Again, this myth, this very sort of deep-rooted myth of Asian women being exotic and somehow coming to the country for illicit purposes, right? That they couldn't be respectable, that they weren't coming under sort of, you know, their intentions were not good. And so this created this kind of gender imbalance in the Chinese community. And again, it was, in my opinion, it was very much a way of, I think, preventing Chinese immigrants from having families and putting down roots, right? Because when you have families and children are US citizens, right? It's kind of about the future. And passing a law like this and saying women can't come into the country in some ways was about, right? Like, oops, sorry, was about sort of about them not having a future in the US, okay? So we see, and this, you know, immigration laws and how they dictated family life, we see this repeating, right? Again and again, but this was one of the first immigration laws ever passed in the US on the federal level. And it's interesting that it was targeting women. And it was really explicitly aimed at like preventing Chinese immigrants from forming families, having children, putting down roots, right? Having those children become citizens, and et cetera, right? Yeah, Sandra, yeah, right? So it was so like demeaning, demoralizing, right, too. And it, and I should say that, you know, even women, I think I mentioned women who did come, were subjected to very humiliating interrogation process. I actually just assigned a article for my students. I'm teaching an Intro to Asian American History class this quarter, and it's about Asian women's experiences at Angel Island. And it looks at the differences in how they're treated versus men, right? And so a lot of questions about their morality, their, you know, are they married, right? It was very harsh and very gendered. And I think we see too this kind of like intersectionality, right? How it's so important to understand race and gender coming together here to restrict Chinese immigrant women. Okay, so this is an image actually that I took from the census in 1900, just to show, right, like how many, like the male, kind of predominantly male population of Riverside's Chinatown. And you can see, right, male and many different ages, right? There's some young men in their 20s, there's men in their 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Even 60s. So this is also kind of an intergenerational, I would say, like community too. So there was diversity in terms of age. There's also a few people here, if you know, birthplace, California. So there are Chinese immigrants as well as Chinese Americans. But again, I think this shows really how much the community was predominantly male, and again, kind of created that way, right, through these immigration laws. There were women, I should say, there were women present, but there were in small numbers. Okay. Oops. Okay, so consequently, right, Riverside, and this is true everywhere, community was mostly male. Oh, Danny's asking what street. on this image or the previous? Okay, this one I couldn't figure out this. So this image here is from 1880. So this was from the original Chinatown, that first one in the city center. This one is from, they don't note streets in China. They just label it Chinatown, and there's like no street. So it's hard to know. Okay, so I want to make the point though, that just because the community was mostly male did not mean that Chinatown was devoid of family life, was not devoid of community and family life. Right? So Chinese men created their own families. They created their own forms of kinship that looked maybe different from the typical nuclear family, right, of the father, the mother, and the children. And I wanted to highlight actually two kinds of family arrangements that were common in a place like Riverside's Chinatown as they were elsewhere. And the first is kind of what I call like a bachelor community, right, or a bachelor family. And this refers to groups of men who live together in the same house or dwelling. They shared the same lodgings and often worked together in the same jobs. So we see this often in like labor camps, right? These were often, you see men kind of living together in labor camps. You also see this in the urban, right, areas as well. So I wanted to kind of highlight one example of this. This comes from the 1880 census. And this is a very typical arrangement that you would see, which are, I think here are 5 Chinese men living together and working together to run a laundry, or it's called a wash house. It was a laundry. And one also working also as a cook. And this was a very common arrangement. So laundries appealed to Chinese immigrants and also other Asian immigrants. Later on, Japanese people operated laundries as well, because they were very inexpensive to operate. And they also provided housing. So what we see is that many Chinese laundry operators and their employees like often lived in rooms in the back of the laundry business, right? So they lived and worked in the same place. So this is kind of one example of one kind of family arrangement, right? Of 5 people who weren't necessarily related by blood, but they lived together, they worked together, and they ran the business together. So again, this is a very common kind of arrangement that we see. Okay. And again, I just wanted to highlight that businesses like this were so common also because, right, Chinese immigrants and later other Asian immigrants couldn't choose where they didn't have a lot of options in terms of housing. They couldn't choose where they wanted to live. They were restricted from many areas. So these also were important as a form of housing, right, to give them a place to live. Okay, so the first really example that's very common is this kind of bachelor community or bachelor sort of family. And the second that I wanted to highlight was a transnational family. Okay, so many of the men in the census, let's see, I don't know if it detailed it specifically. Oh yeah, okay, so many of the men here, note this column shows marital status. So many of them are single, right? But many of them are actually married, right? Which means that their wives were in China. So a transnational family or split kind of family was very common as well. Many Chinese men who came to the US, again, were actually married, but their wives stayed behind in China, again, because of the Page Law. They couldn't come to the US, and so their husbands would come, leave them in China, and then would send money back home every month in the form of a remittance payment. They would save their wages every month, and they would send the wages back to China. And what we actually see is that the wives who were left behind in China become very powerful people in their communities because the wages from the US went pretty far in China at the time. They were able to build homes. They became powerful people in their local villages, in their local communities in China. So it kind of gave them some sort of wealth and status and protected them politically. So that's kind of one interesting, right, side of the story, is looking at the wives who stayed behind. Often they were able to gain some wealth and status within their own local villages and communities back in China. So this is actually an example from a Riverside family. George Wong, who is, I think, one of the more famous, right, Riverside Chinatown residents. He was known as the last resident of Chinatown. He was the last person who lived there. He passed away in the 70s. And he was kind of Chinatown's caretaker and also historian. So he collected a lot of things, and he often gave talks and talked to people about the history of Chinatown. And I believe he also ran a restaurant in Chinatown as well. I'm just seeing some comments in the chat. Yeah, remittances make a big difference. Remittances made a big difference in the lives of these families that stayed behind. So this actually here is a photograph, side-by-side photographs from an actual immigration application. So this is George Wong here. And here he is. I think this was when he was older, and I think this photo is from the early 70s. But his father, his family was, George was born in China. His whole family was in China. George's father, who is pictured here, left China, and he had several children and a wife. He came to the US. You know, he wanted to pursue economic opportunities. He actually owned a vegetable farm. He was kind of a vegetable merchant in Riverside. And when George was 14, he sent for him in China, and he sent for him to come, right, join him in the US, in Riverside. And so this isn't actually a photo from the immigration application. And so then George arrives at the age of 14. We can imagine that he hasn't seen his father in that time, right? He probably doesn't even remember his father. So he joins his father, and he works, he first actually as a servant, a domestic worker in a home. He helps his father with the business. And then he actually ends up attending high school and then college. But this is an example of a transnational family, very common. And George's mother did remain in China. I believe his male siblings came to the US too. His sisters stayed behind, right? Which was very common for the women to stay behind. And then again, this was very common where when the sons would come of age or they become teenagers, they were sent to the US and they would join their fathers. So this is another example of the kind of families, transnational families or split families that we also see, right, forming in Riverside's Chinatown as elsewhere. And again, they didn't look like the typical nuclear families, right, with the mother, the father, the children, all living in one place. But, you know, I think it's important to recognize these kinds of families as families, right, and as important forms of kinship and really setting the foundation of the community in Riverside's Chinatown. Okay, okay, we're running up against time. Very quickly, though, I wanted to sort of wrap up and to talk about Chinatown today, because so much of what I've talked about, I think, is about land. And in the chat, right, it was noted that there was like economic motivations for the land. And I wanted to end by talking about a current effort in Riverside. Many of you might have heard of it. It's called Save Our Chinatown. And it's an effort to preserve the land where Chinatown was located. What happened was many people in this, during World War II and afterwards left Chinatown. So the population declined in Riverside, the Chinese population, to the point where there was only one resident in the 70s, George Wong. But there has been active efforts ever since the 70s, really, to preserve the space and to preserve this land. And there's been many archaeological kind of projects done here where they've found pottery and they found all sorts of really important artifacts. And there's currently an effort to preserve this. I believe it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and to open a heritage park that will be open to everyone, that will inform the public about the history of Riverside's Chinatown, and also to create a new public space, right, for everyone to enjoy. And what we see is that ethnic communities like Chinatowns have always been vulnerable to city and county decisions around land use. So we see this in the 1880s. We see this during this era of, so-called urban renewal after World War II. Chinatowns were often targeted for demolition. And right back, as we've seen in the late 19th century, Chinatown was forced to move. The Chinese residents were forced to move in response to racism and a desire to take, right, the land and to take the space. But I think what's important to take away is that, despite these efforts, Chinese immigrants continued to put down roots. And then they also are continuing into the present, right, to fight to be recognized and to fight to preserve their community even today. So I wanted to end there. And I have some further reading and information. Some of these sources you might have seen already, but I just wanted to put them in one place, things that I actually find really useful in my own when I'm putting together my classes. Again, some are more broadly Asian American focused, some are more on Chinese, some are Riverside focused, but just to give you that resource as well. And again, I also included some primary source materials in case you have students maybe in high school level who kind of want to start doing archival research. You know, there's a really great collection at the Riverside Public Library. It's very accessible, of Harry Lawton, who was really instrumental in the 70s around some of these efforts to preserve Chinatown. So that's it for today. And thank you so much for taking the time and for your engagement. I really appreciate it.